from Britain, and it's worked fairly well for us with exceptions. I'll stop there, Laila, having gone on for much too long. Thank you.
David Malone has given us a lot of food for thought, and I think it's the style and pattern of graduate lectures where you get more questions raised and more doubts shed on the things that you took for granted as givens, as fixed, as Dr. Malone called them. Now we have no one path that works in all countries for development, that governance differs from no ideal governance system that can be applied in any one place, that the different countries that achieve development, it seemed they never relied mainly on development cooperation or aid, that the paths they followed, whether in Singapore or in India or in China, were completely different paths to development, and there's no one prescription, no one size fits all. That interestingly, wars are not always damaging to the economy, corruption is not always economically damaging, and violence is not necessarily bad for stability. So we have a lot to think about. I have a number of questions that were given to me here, but I prefer that each participant will ask his or her own question himself. Just a pattern among the questions received so far, and people are wondering about the relevance of all those experiences to Egypt after the 25th of January revolution. What may we derive from many different countries' experiences that may be of benefit to the Egyptian situation right now after the revolution? Some more specific questions about the Muslim Brotherhood, about even the agricultural sector in Egypt and the no plan in China with the work here. And then we'll open the floor and need more questions from the audience.
Thank you so much. Well, the first thing I should say is that I absolutely loved my 4 years of living in Egypt. There are two countries I've totally fallen in love with that I've lived in. One is Egypt and one is India. And that's why I get them confused as often as I do, by the way, because they're in a separate category in my brain of countries I love. How can all of this be relevant to Egypt? First of all, I think the notion that development is always internally generated and powered has to be very relevant to Egypt. Egypt cannot be looking for salvation from abroad, economic salvation or any other form of salvation. It has to come from within. Aid can help perhaps at the margins once it's clear what Egypt's new project is, but it's not yet clear what Egypt's new project is. International institutions cannot substitute themselves for internal politics. Internal politics are extremely important, whatever form they take. And for example, in Africa, which has been very successful for the last 10 years, defying all the predictions of the experts, politics takes many different forms across the continent, as we know. So I think the key is that Egyptians not engage in a flight from reality, that they confront their reality, including economic management of the country, which has become obscured in the debate. It's become something that we put off until tomorrow in Egypt, as far as I can make out in reading what I read. But putting off the management of the economy in a country of 85 million people, in a region that isn't doing very well economically compared to other regions of the developing world, is a very dangerous bet on the future. So management of the Egyptian economy, it seems to me, is something that any Egyptian parliament, government, needs to have in mind, and also that those demonstrating need to have in mind, at least in the backs of their mind. because Egypt is a country with 85 million people, one of the few countries in the world that continues to have very high population growth, that needs to worry a lot about its economy. One of the untold stories of Asia is that population growth has slowed dramatically, even in countries like India in the last 20 years, but it hasn't really in much of the Arab world and in Egypt in particular. If your population is going to grow by anywhere around 2%, tending up to 3%, it means your economy has to grow by a lot more than that before any positive effect is registered in the population. And I think these basic facts have been absent from much of the dialogue as I follow it in Egypt. I understand that day-to-day politics is much more exciting than economic management, but ultimately competent governments have a basic responsibility to promote economic well-being, social well-being, and be responsible for these areas. So I'd say those are my thoughts on the subject at the moment. I don't have a view on the Muslim Brotherhood. It is now a political actor like other political actors in Egypt. I'm sure it will be judged by the population on the success or failure of its policies. As long as free and fair elections occur, as they do in India, constantly, that's been one of the great successes of India. One of the great pleasures of the Indian public, the voting public, which is essentially the poor of India, because the bourgeoisie doesn't vote in India, it considers itself outnumbered by the poor, which it is to throw the bums out regularly. When the policies don't work, we throw them out. And it happens a lot in India, and it's one of the few great pleasures in the lives of the poor in India. And perhaps we'll see a similar dynamic develop in Egypt, where political parties, governments are judged on the success or failure of their policies. That's what ultimately democracy tends toward, even if it's not always a smooth path. So that's it from me on Egypt.
Questions from the audience? Yes, please. Right, so we'll start where the mic is.
Good. Thank you very much.
Introduce yourself first.
Okay. Thank you very much for your lecture. My name is Takeshi Kobayashi from Japan. As I said before the lecture, I'm very honored to accepting you as a leader of UN University in Tokyo in near future. And my question is, I should tell something before that. The other day, I read an article, column in the New York Times, written by Thomas Friedman. He said that China has strong government, but doesn't have a strong civil society. On the other hand, India has strong civil society, but doesn't have strong government. Do you think which factor is more important for the development, and should which type of factor or which type of example should Egypt choose for its development? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. I have a slightly different take. Friedman is always at the disadvantage because he has to get his arguments into 600 words, and so he takes shortcuts. He's in fact very knowledgeable on both countries. What he says is true, but what he didn't say is that the politicians in India don't pay enough attention to civil society. So while civil society is strong and well organized, the politicians are inattentive and usually looking to their own interests and the funding of their own parties. But where I think China and India are interesting is China does have quite a more successful economic model than India at the moment, but its politics are brittle. Its system of governance is fragile, clearly, and the government knows this. In India, for all the faults of India and for all the faults of Indian politicians, the country is exceptionally stable. Why is it exceptionally stable? In spite of corruption, in spite of violence, in spite of internal insurgencies in large parts of India. It is stable because of democracy, because people feel they have a voice. And they exercise their voice at federal level, at state level, and at local level. And their voice matters through the election process. So Indian civil society is terrific, but on its own, it can't achieve as much as the poor of India do by throwing the worst politicians out.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kevin Paulson. I'm a journalist for Now Online.
Can you raise your voice?
Okay, what's your position towards the current IMF loan deal that's being negotiated? And do you think it's enough, if it gets sealed, do you think it's enough to jumpstart the economy and development efforts in Egypt?
I'll tell you, I haven't studied the proposal from the IMF closely. It may be a good idea or a bad idea, but one loan from the IMF is not going to solve Egypt's problems. The risk always is that a government in desperate need of money will take money it has agreed to spend on certain purposes to do with medium and long-term development, but actually use it for something else which is desperately urgent for it as a government. And that is why so many multilateral loans over the last 60 years have produced disappointing results. It's not that multilateral loans are bad, it's what use do you make of the multilateral loan. So it may be a very good idea, I just don't know.
Questions?
First of all, I welcome you there. I'm different Canadian. I come from Vancouver, British Columbia. My name is Tom Malone. I'm a UN Senior Advisor on Development, Energy, whatever. Anyway, I would like to correct first that the Egyptian population is now 1 million, not 85 as you mentioned. I don't know why they are keeping this secret. The second thing is, I have written a very important paper on the role of ODA, the official development assistance for the development of Egypt, and this paper was banned from being published by the government because it contained sensitive.
The previous government, I hope, right?
Well, actually, yes. But anyway, I just like to know that if this wonderful meeting will come up with recommendations and want to reach the government, please do, because I live across the flat. Across from me is that of Dr. Hisham Kandil. It doesn't bother to me. I will tell him either do it or, quit. One question. One, I have noticed that development assistance in any way is always related to politics. We know that, for instance, in the U.S. Congress, it is the Congress that will approve the development assistance, whether it should come to Egypt or not, and only because of maybe some pressure from the executive office that they will say, okay, at the end. But if it were left up to the lobby in the Congress or the Senate, none would come to Egypt. Why is that? Because there is a relationship between what should be done by this government, they stand in the world, they're working here and there on the national issue, as we know.
The question? Question?
I think we'll take this as a comment, a very interesting comment, and move on to the next question.
No, sir. The question is, how do you see the role of development assistance with the international state of politics?
Well, I'd say, first of all, coming back to something I mentioned earlier, that there is growing confusion amongst the traditional donors, the countries of Europe, the United States, Japan, also my own country, and Australia, about development assistance, because much of the Western world is in a slow-moving economic crisis since 2008, and the developing world is actually doing very well in relative terms. So politicians in the industrialized world, or the Western world, are increasingly wondering, why are we helping people who are doing much better than we are in terms of growth rates and so on. So there is a degree of confusion, I'd say, and a number of countries are cutting their aid programs. As you mentioned, Senator Clinton, President Obama fought very hard for aid during the administration's first term, but because spending is going to be cut a great deal during the second term, as we all realize, development assistance may suffer along with other areas of budget spending, including defense and domestic infrastructure and so on. So I'd say the future of development assistance is unknowable. I think what really matters is for countries and regions themselves to unleash their own potential so that they aren't reliant on development assistance. I think in India it was probably quite exciting for the Indian Prime Minister in 1990 to ask all the donors to leave, which he did.
Unable to have it, which regime do you recommend to have sustainable development?
Well, it's an interesting question, but I have to say that I don't accept your premise. I think Egypt can achieve democracy, and I think what we're living through today is a slow-moving attempt to do so. We don't understand the end point of yet, because it's in the future. So I think Egypt can have democracy. So many other countries that aren't rich do have democracy, although the democratic model is different according to the countries. If you think of Latin America, which was ruled by generals nearly entirely 40 or 50 years ago, it's nearly entirely democratic today. So it can be done, and I'm convinced it will be done in Egypt.
Very good question.
My name is Malone. I'm a public policy graduate student. I wanted to ask you regarding your reference to Iran, and especially the 1979 revolution. Do you think the 1979 revolution in Iran is comparable to the Egyptian revolution of 2011? In terms of its outcomes, in terms of its potential, of the potential future of the country? Do you think that both models are comparable?
Thank you, Omar. The short answer is no. Iranian history is very different from Egyptian history. The succession of Iranian dynasties is different. Iran had a brief experience of genuine parliamentary democracy in the early 50s. And Iran has a very different Shia clergy from the clergy in Egypt. So I think it would be entirely unproductive to compare them unduly. What could be said about Iran and Egypt is they are both very meaningful countries. They are both civilizationally meaningful countries in a region that doesn't have that many. And so they are both important actors in what the Indians always refer to as West Asia. They never talk about the Middle East, they talk about West Asia. So countries like Iran, Egypt, very significant countries, but comparable, no.
Thank you very much. I think one last question from Dr. David.
Hi, thanks. Thank you very much for your talk. My question is a real simple one. You said at the beginning that you had looked at agriculture and had reached some conclusions about how it had changed, and I think you were actually working on agriculture at the same time. And I'm wondering what your conclusions were. A related question to that, one of the big changes, I think, in terms of in a way, of agriculture is that really many of the farmers and rural people have adopted a strategy that I call MTT, which is move to town, and where they have by and large joined the informal sector. And I wondered if you have some comments on that.
Great. Well, first of all, your second very interesting point, I think it happens everywhere. India is, for example, at the moment in the middle of a huge migration involving probably over the next 10, 20 years, 200 million, possibly more people from smaller rural communities into towns. Because they're in search of better jobs, by and large, better livelihoods. Small farming all over the world isn't a recipe for prosperity, alas. I was struck because I went to Luxor on my way from India for a very happy 36 hours, just flying over the Nile Valley, seeing how much towns are eating away at the agricultural land in the valley, and probably in the Delta too, which I haven't been to have a look at. What I concluded 3 years ago was that actually Egypt had done a much better job than most people think in Egypt of ramping up grain production within the country. When I was living here 35 to 37 years ago, India really imported about 70% of its grain. By the time I was here, it was producing 70% of its grain. And this was really an unheralded success. The bad news part of the story was, and it had done this by developing through irrigation new lands which could be cultivated. The bad news I alluded to earlier, which is the water use is probably unsustainable. And it's unsustainable for several reasons. If Egypt alone controlled the Nile, and it controlled it absolutely, perhaps Egypt could carry on with current approaches into the indefinite future. But actually, there are a large number of countries upstream from Egypt on the two Niles, and they find Egypt's policies are infringing on their own ambitions in the agricultural field, and they reject absolutely the Nile Waters Sharing Treaty, which was, of course, a product of the colonial era and served the British interests at the time. It served in particular Sudan and Egypt, and it served much less the countries further upstream. So I think Egypt is going to be constrained to negotiate seriously with those countries if it doesn't want them to act unilaterally. And they can act unilaterally. So I think the diplomatic actors in Egypt are well aware of this. They've been lobbying quite hard for international support of Egyptian views, but so have their antagonists in this particular disagreement. And the terms of the treaty so overwhelmingly favor Egypt rather than other countries that they cannot be expected to respect its terms too much longer if there isn't a serious negotiation. So that's something that I think may wind up leaving Egypt with less water flowing into the country than currently does, and other approaches will then have to be adopted. But I'm convinced with, how can I say, with serious attention to science, to agricultural science, Egypt could produce more, probably with less water than it does today. That's true of most countries, so there's no reason why it wouldn't be true of Egypt. So thank you for your very interesting questions.
Thank you. We still have room for a few more minutes and a few more questions. Ola here, graduate student.
Thank you, sir, for your interesting lecture. My name is Ola Omran. I'm a Master of Public Policy candidate in the AUC. My question is, how can we ensure or keep sustainable development programs and their continuity in the shadow of presence of changing governance regime?
Interesting. It's a very interesting question you ask, and in Western democracy we aren't always good at keeping sound policy going from one government to the next. A given when you have a new government is often that it wants policies of its own, new programs of its own, new announcements of its own. It's, in a way, human nature. Having struggled to achieve power for a long time, when you get to power, you don't just want to adopt the policies of the people who preceded you. But interestingly, there is a sense in many countries of continuity on economic policy. If you look at Brazil, over the last 20 years, it has moved from military dictatorship in the 60s and 70s to incompetent civilian governments for quite a long time, and very corrupt ones. And then they elected finally a very competent government about 18 years ago, led by Enrique Cardoso, who was himself an economist. And he decided that Brazil had the capacity to grow much more, and that if sensible policy were brought to bear, that could happen. He was re-elected for a second term. He was right of center. He was succeeded by the left of center President Lula, who everybody has read about, who in turn has been succeeded by his left of center former Chief of Staff Dilma Rousseff. What was most important in all of this was when Lula came to power, he didn't decide to undo everything that Cardoso had done simply because Cardoso had been on the right and he was on the left. In fact, he kept everything Cardoso had done, but added to it interesting social dimensions which Cardoso had not had time or perhaps even interest in developing. So Lula's signature wasn't the destruction of his predecessors' successes, it was the addition of very ambitious social policies. In Brazil, you've probably all heard of Bolsa Familia, which has been quite successful in Brazil. And now President Rousseff is looking for policies of her own, more in the area of sustainable development, how Brazil can do a better job of respecting its environment. And secondly, what are the gaps in social policy that still need to be addressed? So what was extremely important was having a competent government that didn't decide to destroy everything the previous competent government had done. So I hope Egypt experiences something similar.
I hope so too. There's a repeated question that came up several times here in different ways. Again, there's an eagerness to know the relevance of the discussion to the Egyptian situation, and people are asking about what's the most important obstacle to development in Egypt, and some are asking what's the most important #1 priority that we should start up with. People are waiting for you to give us a...
I think actually that's a question, honestly, I think that's a question only Egyptians should answer. I never give talks in India telling the Indians what to do. They throw me out. It's up to you to decide what your policies are going to be, what your path is going to be, and your international friends, very much including me, We'll follow with sympathy whatever path you adopt, and we'll support you to the extent we can. But it really needs to be your choices and your policies with which all of you feel a sense of association. And that's what's been successful in Brazil. It was very much Brazilian driven.
Dr. Hen?
Hamid Ali, Department of Public Policy. My question is, comments and question. The economic reform sometimes is driven by the donors and the creditors. One that is going to be originated as domestic priorities. And I try to look very hard. Any country that being successful because of the creditors and the donors requested demand. Because right now we are talking about the IMF loans. The loans is a credit card. They want to give you a credit card, and then you're going to pay off in the long run. Short-term gains for the long-term payment that the country could pay huge, multiple amount of that money. So is it better for Egypt as a strategy to seek the moratorium on the debt that they paid, rather than getting the loans? They say that just stop, give us a grace period that is, we will be taking time to give you the debt, pay off the debt, because Egypt is paying about 700 or 800 million dollars per year, which is too huge, too much amount of money. The other thing that I have is about the reform. India has, China started with the land reform. For Egypt, that much land that is available is, land reform is important, but not the key important thing. Probably Egypt is the educational reform. Might be they better start with education reform than the land reform or anything, so that they become the supply, talents and the skills to the international labor market and in the Arab world and in the Gulf countries.
Well, thank you for that. And I think you pinpointed some of the problems, and very accurately, some of the problems of international borrowing. It has to be added also that Egypt had all of its official debt forgiven about 20 years ago. And I don't think the donors are going to be very interested in that a second time. I might be wrong. And there is usually a price to be paid for not an agreed moratorium, which Egypt might be able to achieve. Egypt might achieve an agreement with its creditors to suspend payment for a while. I think the world is very sympathetic towards Egypt. But I think a unilateral moratorium leads to big problems, which we have often seen in Latin America. So I think one needs to be careful about what sort of a moratorium one would be in favor of. And as to the loans, as I mentioned, I think what matters is what uses are the money actually put to. Because governments will often sign an agreement with a donor community or a single donor saying, yes, I will spend it all on, agriculture, but actually wind up spending it on something completely different that's much less productive. So that is another risk with loans. But there's no doubt that financing is necessary for development, and there's no doubt that development is hard to achieve without economic growth. There used to be a school in the West that argued that largely for environmental reasons, that economic growth was bad in and of itself, and that we should be, in effect, not striving towards it. But actually, I don't know a single country that has achieved higher development indicators without having economic growth. And so some funding to achieve economic growth is usually necessary. Where that funding comes from, whether it's internally generated. Many poor countries have very high internal savings rates. Both China and India are examples of that. The savings rate in China is 45% and in India 31%. And that's why India and China aren't very interested in donors, or they aren't obsessed with borrowing. So you have to look at the structure of Egypt's economy and see what can be done, what resources can be mobilized internally, and then calculate whether and how much you needed from abroad and which would be the best way to proceed. But it's not strictly the IMF shows up and has a proposal, or the government wants to borrow, you know, some $1 billion from the IMF. It's a lot more complicated than that, or it should be a lot more complicated than that, in my view.
Thank you. Having been posted in Bhutan, should we learn something from Bhutan and their concern with the indicator for happiness, the gross national indicator of happiness? And we start by applying this here in Egypt and postpone other issues of concern that would take a lengthier period of time, just on a lighter note?
Well, certainly, thinking back to my years in Egypt, Egyptians made me very happy. So I was happy during my time here. And one of the things I liked about Egypt was how very warm and nice Egyptian people were all over the country, to somebody who spoke Arabic very badly. That being said, I'd say there is an evolution in thinking on development. There's been an evolution away from thinking of development simply as economic growth towards conceptions of human development, which are much broader, in which the Indian economist and philosopher Amartya Sen played an important role with his Pakistani best friend, Mahbub al-Haq, about between 30 and 20 years ago, which has produced the Human Development Index and things like that. The Bhutanese argument is, in effect, that even the Human Development Index doesn't actually translate notions of well-being with enough subtlety, and so notions such as happiness should be integrated, how you measure happiness, not easy. Bhutan is itself, in many ways, a very smart country, and at the same time a happy country. It's sandwiched in between China and India. It's the only neighbor of India that has conspired to have good relations with India, and that pays off big time if your huge neighbor next door is well disposed. So a lot of Bhutan's development has been funded one way or the other by India. Secondly, the Bhutanese have been wise enough to say no to a lot of the dimensions that the international development business is attached to. So there's very little donor presence in Bhutan. The country lives in a way at its own rhythm. It is developing very, very fast. Its growth rates are, last time I looked, it was something like 12%, which they've been achieving over a number of years now. But there are risks, and not everything is sweetness and light in Bhutan, because for the Bhutanese it's a happy situation, but you might, with a suspicious mind, say, amidst all this happiness, who might be happy? And the answer would be, well, the very poor Indian laborers who are brought in to do all the hard work in Bhutan, of road building and so on, may be less happy than their Bhutanese hosts. Certainly, their fate in life is a less happy one.
Not everybody was called.
I'd say, again, no system is absolutely perfect. And Bhutan, with its admirable qualities, isn't working quite as hard as some countries, but perhaps not working quite so hard makes you happier. Who knows?
Thank you very much. I think we've kept you for an hour and a half, and we may have a lot of questions.
From your experience in China, you know the Chinese motto, don't give me the fish, teach me how to catch it. Can you apply this to Egypt? Can it be done?
Almost certainly yes, but I respect the chair, so I'm going to stop.
We can continue discussions maybe while over cups of tea outside. We just need to thank Dr. Robert. We really were fortunate to have you with us here. It's a very wide topic. It cannot be covered in an hour, 2 hours, or several years. We can continue the discussion about development, but it's a starting point and refreshing to raise all those issues of concern. Definitely, it's been a very challenging and thought-provoking discussion, and hopefully we will be having you over maybe in your next visit.
Thank you very much. Thank you.